Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. My special guest today is Peter Strydom, who is the CEO of Amway Japan. Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you, Greg. Thanks for the invitation.
So, Peter, you've got a big job here in Japan. So how is it that you're in Japan running the company here? And I know you've got a big organization, so maybe give people a sense of how many people in the organization and why you are in Japan running Amway.
Sure. Well, I consider myself very lucky to be doing that, Greg. I've been in Amway for roughly 24 odd years now.
Oh, okay.
I'm South African by birth. Mm-hmm. I'm married to an Italian. Mm-hmm. I work for an American company, and I'm based here in Japan. So I'm a little bit of a global citizen, I guess, in some respects. But I've literally worked for the company starting in my native South Africa. Subsequently, after running the business there, moving to Europe. I was based in Barcelona in Spain for a period of time. Very tough job, I might add.
That's what they call a hardship post, is it?
It was really rough, yes. But looking after the markets of Southern Europe at the time, which needed a lot of a renovation and overhaul. They were getting old and they needed work. Subsequent to that, I moved to Munich in Germany and I ran the business. I was MD for Europe for a considerable amount of time. And then 6 years ago, they posted me here to Japan. And why Japan? Well, my mentor and upline at the time said to me, look, Peter, the bulk of our business, the weight of our business is in Asia. And if you really want to understand and do the best job you possibly can within the world of Amway, you need to be in Asia. Mm. And Amway Japan really is kind of one of the jewels in the crown of Amway globally. It's about $1 billion business here, just shy of $1 billion. We've got a large number of independent distributors that work here, probably in excess of 600,000 independent distributors just in Japan. And that's been built up over the last 40 years. So we're a 40-year-old business here in Japan, part of the kind of the social infrastructure and fabric of the country, we like to think, at least anyway, with a long future ahead of us. And from an employee standpoint, we have probably around about 400 or so employees directly with here at Amway Japan. So it's an interesting mix. So, as we talk about business, it's going to be this tension between, what happens from a leadership perspective within our organization, but also more broadly within this network of independent distributors we have right across the business in Japan. So yes, Japan is a big it's a big feather in my cap to be here, part of this, one of our leading top 3 businesses in the world, highly profitable, highly successful with, I believe, and the shareholders believe, a huge upside for growth.
Yeah, well, that's $1 billion business, or close to $1 billion is impressive. 400 people producing that is super impressive. And so if you think about your early days, you've come from, quite substantial leadership positions in Europe and South Africa. You come to Japan, you arrive here. Presumably you don't know Japanese culture, you don't know Japanese language, but you know Amway, you know the business, but you arrive here. In those early days, 6 years ago, what were some of the challenges that you first noticed that, things are a bit different here?
Yes, things are different here, but I think I was armed with one benefit, and that is having worked in other parts of the world. One thing you do learn is humility. You realize that you are a guest in another culture, you are a guest in another country. And I think that not all, I still got a long leadership journey ahead of me, but a lot of the kind of the overconfidence that one has walking into a new country and a new culture and a new job was knocked out of me along the way. And I think that did stand me in good stead. But one of the things that I faced, I found difficult here was the sense that, we come in our roles as CEOs into these big multinational jobs, generally with a change management mandate. And coming here to Japan, generally I was following in the shoes of other similar CEOs that have a 3 to 5 year deal. generally, right? And so having a change management mandate on the one hand, you walk into generally a large degree of systemic resistance to change. And I don't know if that's particular to Japan. I think it's probably exists in many, many companies. But I think overcoming that has been a fundamental issue for me, to be able to facilitate change in an environment where initially people are saying, okay, well, let's just wait for this guy to see, to see his few years through and then wait for the next guy kind of thing. So I've been here for 6 years now, and I think those 6 years have certainly helped me a little bit along that journey.
So a lot of wait him out people are disappointed. Okay, he's still here. Okay.
And that's normal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's human nature. I wouldn't blame that on Japanese culture, but particularly, I think that's human nature.
So, well, change is an issue. If we think about, apart from the broad aspect of change, which, as you say, everyone believes in change,
right?
Except they want to stay the same.
Yeah.
So everyone else should change, and I don't want to change. Right. That's normally how we think about change. But we'll come back to change and what you did about that. But what are the things, from an actual leadership point of view, when you started dealing in the day-to-day with your Japanese team, particularly, or your may have had some international people in the team as well, what were some of the challenges that you saw early? Oh, okay, this is culturally different for me. I don't speak the language. I've got to make some adjustments here. What were some of those things that occurred to you?
It's a great question. I think one of the big standouts, the big learnings for me was that, I come from a business culture of creating shareholder value. The for-profit motive is a primary driver in so much of our decision-making, so much of our change management. The reasons behind our change management are to drive additional profit, drive additional shareholder value. And I soon realized that doesn't really work here. It didn't work for me. And
why was that?
I think the big realization, and I'm probably going to describe this in horribly simplistic terms, so forgive me, but I came to realize that one of the unique driving forces here from a business standpoint has been to offer value beyond the business, value to society, value to the people that work for you, value to your stakeholders, and building that takes priority over the for-profit motive.
So how did that come about? Because, as you say, multinational businesses getting up to that scale are very profit-oriented, and it's very clear, shareholders, or clients, they sort of often compete for which is number one, and the sort of staff come number three, And so what triggered that realization for you that, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to have to adjust my thinking a little bit here and go a bit more broad in terms of spectrum around who I'm serving? So what triggered that idea for you, if you can remember? Or it might not have been one thing, but what came up that you realized, oh, this is a bit different?
Well, I'm paraphrasing this, but the reaction I've had to many of the change management initiatives we started to introduce was, why? Why are you changing that? It's working just fine. It's worked just fine like that for the last 10 years. Why in heaven's name would you want to change it? That's a good question, right? And I think that gave me pause to say, okay, you need to expand the definition and dig a little bit deeper as to why you're doing this, not only for today, but for the impact it's going to have on people and for what it means for the future of the business. Those are, I think, it challenged my leadership ability rather than relying on a very binary, is it going to make us more money kind of answer. It's a far more sophisticated answer that I need to give. And I mean, this, Greg, from all of your vast experience in leadership, that unless you can explain to people why they have to do something, you're never going to get fellowship. And so I think the digging deeper to be able to respond to why we're doing something was perhaps the biggest leadership challenge I had.
And also, headquarters doesn't know Japan in detail. Right. They've got a profit driver. Okay, Peter, you're going to Japan. We want more profit. Very clear what the job role is. And then you have this epiphany that, hang on a second, I've got a little bit of a broader role here, really. Right. So one of the things for people in your position is often to be the person to not only persuade the Japanese team or the team in Japan about what's got to happen in terms of direction, but also explain to headquarters, well, actually in Japan, we shouldn't just be focused on money. We should be looking at this from a broader perspective, a more long-term perspective, and include other stakeholders that normally perhaps we don't think about. So how did you go, because it's all right for you to suddenly get the epiphany, but headquarters go, no, Peter, just concentrate on the bucks, we'll all be good. So how did you go about sort of juggling, picking up from the Japan side some things that perhaps hadn't occurred to you, and then having to parlay that back to headquarters in a way that they could say, oh, we see that, go with that, Peter?
Well, I think that the drive from headquarters to create shareholder value doesn't go away. And I don't think I could or I should convince them that it's no longer important. I think it's up to us in our roles here as CEOs to be able to juggle those two things. That's why we are here. That's why we are put in a position to be able to balance the need to drive profitability, to drive growth as important and priority issues, but at the same time take care of these more personal, these more societal concerns that are important here within the local context. So I think that's the balancing act, and I think that probably determines which CEOs or foreign CEOs are successful here in Japan and which aren't. I mean, to your point, we face these comparisons all the time. Oh gosh, you in Asia, all those Asian markets must be the same. And we know that the Asia-Pacific region is probably the most least homogeneous area of the world. So for example, our business in Japan and our business in Korea are of similar size. And there's a very natural tendency to look at the data set across Japan and Korea and start making comparisons. So say, hey, hang on, this business is twice as productive in this area and you're half as productive. What you going to do about that? And those types of comparisons. And I think it does behoove us to be able to educate our people in headquarters that making those comparisons are overly simplistic, and it's more nuanced than that. But at the same time, be able to not just make excuses, being able to say, okay, well, how do we harness the nuances of your market in order to drive growth and drive profitability? So give you an example. Our corporate social responsibility programs here in Japan currently are devoted to supporting the victims of the 3/11 disaster in Tohoku, and have been for the last number of years. And so we've been building community houses there. We've been supporting the people there. We've been working with the communities to build these facilities, and not in a way that is necessarily very visible to everybody because it's up in Tohoku, but we believe it's the right thing to do. And here's the thing, that idea has resonated with all of our stakeholders in Japan. It's opened doors for us in the Diet. It's opened doors with us with other influence. It's that people have said, hang on, if you're doing that, then you've got our attention. And I think those are, that's a kind of probably an example of the balancing act that we need to talk about. So do I talk about our CRM activities at length to our people in headquarters? No. But we do these things here because they are the right things to do, but they also further our commercial objectives.
So from the point that you arrived to this sort of epiphany or this gradual realization that it can't just be about the money, was that something that took place and did it take a year for that to come to your attention? Was it 6 months? How rapidly were you able to discern that actually what they're telling me is actually probably something I should be looking at and I need to change my thinking? How quickly were you able to make that transition?
It wasn't quick enough, Greg. Honestly speaking, it wasn't quick enough. I would like to say it was in the first 2 years. It wasn't. It's something that grew on me over the last few years. I would say I only started hitting my stride here in Japan after 3 to 4 years.
Which is an interesting point, because a lot of people's postings are for 3 years.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly the point. People come here on a 3 to 5 year deal. They're only just hitting their stride when they've come to the end of their tenure of 5 years, and they're out of here. Now you've got to start all over again. I think that big multinationals undermine the ability to gain traction, leadership traction in the market with that sort of approach. Put somebody in here, let them stick around, let them understand, let them learn, let them adapt. It takes time, and then the rewards that you get out of that are multiplied, enormously.
And the point you make before about discerning what the local team is telling you is actually relevant from what they're telling you is just inertia, because they've always done it that way. Trying to discern that line is not that easy, because when you don't know the culture, you don't speak the language, you're being told things, and you have to sort of say to yourself, well, is that true? Do I believe that? How can I find evidence around that? How can I test that? What can I do to actually know if what I'm being told is the actual case, as opposed to people have a certain agenda, they're following their agenda, they want to make my agenda their agenda, but that may not be where the company wants to go. It's like a bit of a fog, really. How do you find your way through that fog to actually work out that, okay, yeah, I am going to accept this part of what I'm being told, but this part, no, I'm not going to accept that. How did you get to the point where you could actually work out which was which?
I've always been a little bit pessimistic of that type of response from people, and I think that stood me in good stead. And perhaps that was helped along by me working in many different countries. And because I'll tell you what, wherever you go, you sit down with the Italians and they say, look, Peter, we're different in Italy. It's completely different to everywhere else. You need to understand that. Sit down in Turkey, it's the same thing. Ukrainians, hang on, Ukraine is different from everybody else. It's this very common thread amongst people to try and define their situation as something that's completely unique, and therefore it requires certain forgiveness for things, or it needs a unique approach. And while we do need to listen to those things, I've always been somewhat pessimistic about them. I think that has held true here. I think in Japan it's compounded by the fact that organizations are A, very hierarchical in nature, and B, very siloed in the way they operate, functionally siloed. And so from a leadership perspective, you're faced with very often, in the first case, in a hierarchical sense, people might tell you exactly what you want to hear. But you go one layer down into the organization and it's business as usual. Nothing is changing. It doesn't get through that layer. From a silo point of view, you find that those two things don't talk to each other, and so you have that level of dysfunction. And I think my approach from a leadership perspective has been to try and aggressively almost break down the barriers between the functions and to collapse the hierarchy.
How did you do that?
I don't think I've been entirely successful at it. I work at it constantly, and I would say that it's been helped enormously by the pandemic, but perhaps I'll come back to that in a minute. The way I've liked to go about it is with an informal management style, a servant leadership approach, which has been empowering by nature, but it's also required me to have an ear and listen and participate in meetings with employees that are not only in my front line, but deeper down into the organization.
So just on that point, as you say, Japan is a rather hierarchical structure. So in my experience, as soon as you go down 2 layers, the layer in the middle, who's usually your direct reporting line, get extremely nervous and get extremely worried about what's going on here. So how do you tap into probably the more accurate picture of actually what is going on, as opposed to what you're being told is going on, But how do you keep that upper layer still with you and engaged when you go around them to the people below?
We've done a number of initiatives here where we have working together with our HR colleagues, taken a function, for example, and broken it up into pieces that are determined by level, so that people are sitting in small groups. So sitting with small group of people that are pretty much at the same level and having conversations about the way things are working, not about the work, but the way things are working, processes, follow through, people being supported, all those types of things. And then having the same conversation with people perhaps lower in that function that are all at a lower level. But because they're not sitting at the table with their uplines, there's generally a higher degree of freedom to communicate and to talk. And I think just encouraging that free flow of conversation, which was part of my breaking down the hierarchy, breaking down the barriers kind of mission, if you will, which was really to encourage authentic communication. Tell me how it's going. Tell us how it's going. We want to know. We want to understand. We want to make it better. I think that's helped. Do I think that it has solved some of those systemic issues? I don't think so. I think that there's a long road to go. I don't know if we'll ever really solve them entirely. But I think recognizing that they're there and actively trying to work against them is very, very important. And I mentioned the pandemic. Greg, I think the pandemic's done an amazing thing from a work culture point of view and our ability to lead, because it's broken down the hierarchical barriers. It's forced everyone to work online, which obviously they didn't know how to do before, and now all of a sudden everybody's doing it. But I'm connecting with truckloads of more people in the organization, and I'm having chat sessions weekly with all sorts of people in the organization, right from the lowest levels up, and having wonderful conversations with them in a medium, that is very intimate. And there's a confidence to speak up, to speak your mind, tell you how I'm feeling, or how I'm working, and things of that nature. And I think it's really moved that agenda along remarkably. Who would have thought? The pandemic would help something like that. I think we want to keep some of that going, certainly this post-pandemic world. I mean, the reverse is I invite people here to my office. We're sitting here in our offices. It's pretty nice and it's grand. People feel intimidated coming here. They feel intimidated. Who's seeing me walk in the door here into this suite of offices? And so I think having this far more informal, online version of working has eliminated that awkwardness, that social awkwardness, and given people the freedom to speak. And I think it's a powerful weapon in our leadership arsenal.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. Interesting insight. Thank you. In terms of getting people engaged with the direction that the company needs to take, because that's your job, is to set the direction. You've mentioned about going down in the organization, and now you're talking about having these direct conversations with people. What other things have you done to get engagement? I'm thinking, what things did you try when you first got here, thinking, well, I've got to get engagement around the direction over those first couple of years, and what maybe the pandemic has changed the nature of it, but are there other things you're doing now that you weren't doing then, or were there some things you thought this would work but it actually didn't work, or things you didn't think would work, they did work? What was that ability to get engagement, and how did you go about it in those first few years?
Well, our engagement scores, I think like many other businesses here in Japan have been traditionally low. Right. I mean, I like you meet with many of our gaishike colleagues around, and you hear about low engagement scores. What are we going to do about that? And that was true for us here. I mean, I faced that. Just trying to find out where people are at, surveying people. I mean, awful. I mean, enormously frustrating getting those survey scores. I actually, to be very, very frank with you, I got to a point with these, engagement surveys where we put all these, the survey scores were so low relative to the rest of the world. We'd put all these plans in place, execute against the plans, and the bar didn't move at all. And I almost got to the point where, you know what, I don't know even if this is a good investment of our time any longer. And then the pandemic came along, and as I said, turned that on its head. So our engagement, both our survey scores, our engagement on strategy, our engagement informally with our teams, has increased exponentially. It's been quite remarkable.
So just thinking about what you're saying there, does that imply that when we're in these leadership positions at the top and we're communicating about where we're going, we imagine that is actually filtering all the way down to the bottom. But when you get the surveys back, you start to realize, okay, I thought I made that pretty clear. Why is this coming up? And now listen to you say that by going direct to some of those 400 people, you're able to have a more intimate personal conversation. They feel more engaged because of that connection with you. They're getting from the horse's mouth, so to speak, directly what's really going on. It's not being filtered through their boss. They feel they got more ownership. Is that how you think it's gone?
Well, remember, perhaps yes, but with one caveat, and that it's not all about me. So whatever I'm talking about here with respect to my experience is being duplicated throughout the organization. There's far more of these conversations, these connections happening in the business today than were happening before. So, I mean, my way of managing and leading has always been a kind of a servant leadership approach. It's been very over-indexed on empowerment. So these messages, I'm not the sole message carrier. This is, my leadership team do a marvelous job of this. Communicating strategy, getting feedback, communicating strategy, answering questions, ask me anything sessions, giving people the opportunity to have a two-way conversation about these, not just sitting in our auditorium and hearing it, voice from the top, one and done. There are conversations happening about it today that weren't happening before. And I think that's helpful. And I think it's helped them in their jobs too. But talking of, that kind of empowerment way of working, there's also a downside to that. Maybe we can come around to that too, which I've kind of learned within this cultural context. But for most part, engagement way up, cascading through the organization better than it ever has before. And so if there's ever golden silver lining around a pandemic, this is it from a leadership standpoint.
So you talk about the downside of the empowerment. What was that, or what is that?
I guess it's one of the ways to be effective. Certainly in our business here, but I think in my philosophy in many business is to build trust. Trust is the cornerstone of anything you want to do to change the business, to improve the business, to change behavior, or any of those things. And I think we can expand on trust in a moment, because I can talk about that for hours. But a downside, and this is my leadership journey right now, is a downside of this for me, I've learned, is I can almost trust too much and empower too much to the point where people feel that I have perhaps abdicated some of my responsibility or provided them with enough air cover in case they make a mistake. And so I think it's been an interesting challenge for me to say, in as much as I want to empower people almost 100%, and some of the feedback has been, hang on, I want you to have skin in the game here with me, and give me the air cover should things kind of, go off course a little bit. And I think that's been an interesting thing. People feel that, I want shared accountability, not all the accountability.
Is that something different? Your previous leadership experiences, you've got this servant leader concept of leadership, and so you're applying that, I'm sure, in other locations. In those other locations, when you were trying to push out this opportunity for people to have more control, have more say, be more empowered around decision making, in those cultures, were they grabbing that and saying, great,
yes,
let me do it? Whereas here they're saying, skin in the game, please.
Yeah. I think that's a very good description of it, Greg. I came with, my previous experience has been, the more you can empower me, the happier I am, the more effective I am. Coming here, there's a little bit of a different nuance to it. Yes, I want empowerment. I want the trust, but I want you to share account. I want the feeling that I share accountability with everybody, but I want to feel like you're accountable with me, that you're going to give me the air cover should that be needed.
So why do you think that is in Japan? I mean, you talk about Ukraine is different, Italy is different, etc. before. Why is it that the Japanese team want to have that shared accountability and have your skin in the game as well, as opposed to saying, great, I have got control, I've got trust here, I can go forth? What do you think is driving that?
Greg, you're more of a veteran here than I am and ever will be, but my sense is that it's a fundamental aversion to risk. Which I appreciate, and that aversion requires that your upline does perhaps have final, sometimes decision-making authority, or take responsibility or accountability for a certain direction that even I may feel empowered to choose. I'd still like to run it by you and make sure that you're okay with that. So that if it does go a little bit off course, that you're kind of accountable with me, and I think that's fair. That's a cultural nuance that I've learned to appreciate, and it works here.
The so-called spinach, right? The horenso or hokoku, report. Okay, renraku, make contact, and sodan,
right,
consult. This is how Japanese, when they enter the workforce, are taught. Don't do anything and blow up this company before you tell people what's going on. Right. So that sort of risk aversion has been scaled into the structure, right, of leadership here from top to bottom. And we're trying to perhaps change that a little bit to have more accountability. And we were talking before about engagement and some of the things you were doing to get people engaged. So, for me, it's quite clear, unless you have people engaged, then you're not going to get innovation, because, if they don't care if it's better or worse, they're not going to care about making it better. Just pick up the salary every month and charge on. Don't want to know about responsibility. But when people are engaged, they are thinking about the business. They are thinking, well, how could we make this better? How could we do things differently? So how do you go about getting innovation? That'll be like part A of the question. And part B is very important, linked to that, is how do you handle mistakes? So how do you, last couple of years that you've been here now, you've sort of got your stride going, you've got the trust is being built, you're getting the engagement you feel, and how do you now get them to be the generators of ideas as opposed to your sort of top line of management, presumably, which has got quite a few non-Japanese in it. So how do you make sure you're not the one who's the sort of the catalyst for change or ideas or innovations?
Well, isn't it always true, Greg, that that us top guys don't have all the good ideas? We never have. All the good ideas generally come from the organization. They bottom up. And I think how to cultivate innovation is uniquely more complex and difficult here in Japan, given the hierarchical nature of things and everything we've discussed. The way we approached this was to really set about looking at our culture as an organization as a starting point. There's that famous quote, culture beats strategy. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like that in this. So we looked at our culture and we said we need to try and put a philosophy in here that cultivates innovation, a desire or a willingness at least to take risk and to fail. And so we adopted, a lot of the principles around having a growth mindset. We spoke about it. We had team meetings about it. We shared material about it. We had training sessions about growth mindset. The ideas of loving to learn, that we're on a learning journey. The idea that taking risks is okay. The idea that failure is okay.
Just on those 2 points, because, we're talking about previously risk-averse.
No, it's countercultural,
culture, right?
It's countercultural.
And here we go. We're saying, ever since you've been born, you've been told no mistakes, no errors, no defects.
Right.
But now, at Amway, you can experiment and you can make mistakes. So go forth and be creative. So how do you actually get people to believe that they can have that freedom and go against the cultural norm?
I think with difficulty, I think is the answer. But I just look back over the last few years and see that we've made progress on that. And I think the progress is very evident in our younger generation. The younger Japanese people that tend to be joining our business tend to be multicultural, they tend to be bilingual, they tend to be exposed to the rest of the world. And so some of those mores of those ways of working have perhaps are less prevalent. There's a higher risk tolerance for them. There's a more openness to fail. And you're right. I mean, the whole idea of fail fast. I always use this with our guys in HQ. Nothing could be more countercultural than fail fast. Why in heaven's name would I want to fail fast? But I think in this process of talking about the emphasis is on not the outcome, the emphasis is on what we learn. And then celebrating that along the way. And so as people have done different things, they've tried new things, we have gone out of our way not to penalize failure. At least, I think, at our level, my executive team level, that's what we've tried to do. And I think some of it's permeated the organization successfully. I would think we've got a long way to go. But we've had a business partnership, for example, with a company that will remain unnamed. The partnership, we went into this and a lot of our people said, why would you want to do that? It's not going to work. We went into it, we poured money into it, and guess what? It didn't work. And the outcome of that is we haven't, wrapped anybody over the knuckles. We said, what can we learn out of this? We've praised people coming out of that process. This is great. Look at the insights that we've had out of this. Look at the learnings. And I think that's given people courage. And so it's a journey. I think we've made progress on it. But I think we just got to keep on beating that drum. So it was a Clem Drucker that said, culture.
Well, it's attributed to Peter
Drucker.
Drucker, but some people question whether he actually said it. But okay. let's imagine but Drucker said it. It's a good quote, right?
Okay,
it's a good quote.
There you go. So I think that holds true, because unless people are willing to work differently, to try new things, to push change through the organization is just going to hit a brick wall. It's just going to hit a brick wall. It's been very, very important here.
So one of the things that often comes up in Japan is, from a Japanese perspective, the right answer is not as important as what is the right question. And I think from a Western culture point of view, we're very focused on the right answer. And we don't often think back about what was the right question we should be asking here.
That's a great
We're sort of on the output rather than the input, And so I think that when you first come across that in Japan, it's a bit like, oh, that's quite smart. We don't do it that way. I wonder why we don't do it that way. Why don't we spend more effort and time on having the right question so that when the answer does come up, we're making progress as opposed to, let's go in there. In terms of...
I like that. I'm going to use it, by the way.
Yeah, well, it works. It works here, certainly. They certainly... I think this is part of this risk aversion. The sort of typical thing is the CFO pulls down the green eye shade and sharpens a pencil and says, well, Peter, if we have a 5% defect rate here, we will make this much more money. And back at headquarters are going, good, go for that. Don't worry about the 5% defect rate because you can pay for it. You've got this extra dough. Whereas Japanese would just be an anathema. How could you possibly do that? What about the trust? What about the brand? What do we represent here? We've got this broader stakeholder obligation, to society, et cetera, et cetera. So those sort of classic Western logical, pragmatic decisions often don't flow very well.
Don't compute.
You talked about trust before. Let's go back and talk a bit more about trust. You see, you talk about it for hours. Well, let's talk about it. So, you arrive, you've had a lot of broad experiences overseas. You come to Japan, you've got your mission, you realise over time that you've got to slightly change the direction of that mission a little bit or broaden it out a little bit. And you're trying to get people engaged by talking levels down, etc. How did you find what was difficult about building the trust and what things were you able to do to actually get that trust working?
My mentor once said to me, and it's informed my career, was people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that holds true in our Amway world. As I mentioned at the outset of this interview, we have kind of two dimensions to leadership here. One is our internal with our staff and our employees, and the others is with a vast network of independent distributors out there who are fundamentally a volunteer army that aren't accountable to me necessarily. And so, how do you exert influence as opposed to manage these people? And so we because of that kind of environment we work in, we need to demonstrate a mission that has heart behind it, that has genuine care for people. So our business is a people business. It's a relationship business. The ties that bind the hundreds of thousands of people here in Japan alone and that have built our business over the last 40 years are bonds of emotion and trust. They're not of reporting line accountability at all. And so one has to. So I've been in that environment where getting anything done is through influence and through trust, as opposed to saying, "Listen, you're going to do it this way," and off you go. So I think that's an important bit of context. Give you an example, just outside of our corporate world for a moment, this broader network that we operate in. If those bonds of trust broke, our business model would collapse. And so, we have, fundamental commitments that, for example, when we enter into a market like Japan, we're in there for the long haul. We don't go into a market, try and make some money and then get out. Any of our competitors that have tried to do that just don't succeed anywhere. So that trust is like super, super important.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. Well, one thing is often companies talk about trust, but then when the rubber meets the road, all that talk about the clients, customers, distributors, etc., how important they are, out the window. and it's a scramble for the money, and so the rhetoric and the reality start to diverge. So how do you make sure that the words translate into a reality, that the perception of the reality is what you want it to be? Great to have the headline. Everyone buys into the headline, but the reality is the proof in the pudding. So how do we get within the organisation structure the reality to be the reality we really say it is?
There's once again, I think, two nuances to that. If we talk about our distributor network, following through on what we promise and what we say is like super important. Super important. Because if we don't, we toast. It's as simple as that. And yes, certainly sometimes situations dictate that you simply can't do something. Whatever happens, you can't launch a product because you run out of raw material or whatever. That's a reality. But for the most part, we're very, very focused on following through what we promise on. And some of those things are very, very fundamental. So we focused on making sure we pay all of our people on time. We pay them what we promise we're going to pay them in commissions. And we have a track record over 40 years that proves that, so that people say, you know what, when they say they're going to do that, they're going to do it. Product quality. We say, listen, this is the best of its kind. We can back it up. Very, very important. When we say we're going to execute a particular strategy, we do it and we follow through. I think so. Being true to your word is very, very important and very, very fundamental for us. Internally, things are more dynamic, because corporate strategies change. You have different organizational structures. So people change in the organization. They have different priorities, and that becomes a little bit more difficult to say, hey, listen, I know I promised you, we're going to do that this year, but I can't because, the upline said something different. Those dynamics happen. My default position has been, be brutally honest with your people. Just be totally transparent. And so when I spoke about earlier on, about trust and communication and growth mindset, implicit in there was a transparency of communication without BS, without spin, that I think engenders trust. And when things or circumstances do change and evolve outside of your control, you say, hey, listen, I know I said this, I can't do it because of this, and this is the reason why, people are far more willing to accept it. And it doesn't necessarily undermine the trust relationship. Authenticity in communication, any leadership communication in my book, is absolutely key.
Well, we actually always talk a good game. We generally tend to be optimistic, I think, because we have to purvey that optimism to everybody. Even if we may not necessarily be 100% optimistic ourselves, we still have to purvey that. And so that communication piece is very critical. What communication methodologies have you found, apart from that going down, multi-layers down and talking directly to people and now doing it through online meetings? What other things have you found have been very effective from a communication point of view? You've got 600,000 distributors, you've got 400 staff. It's a massive enterprise. So you must be, over time, you must have realised there are certain tools that work extremely well, or that you've found maybe not just in Japan, in other societies, other businesses that you've run that have worked very well. What's your sort of go-to for communication excellence?
It's a huge question. I mean, there's two sides to that. Once again, Greg. I mean, there's a technological and tactical side to that, and then there's a method side to it, in how you communicate. We, from a channel point of view and getting reach, we use all technology at our disposal. So we do a lot of public speaking. On stages, in meetings, in seminars, and those meetings range from anything from a small room full of people like this to it could be an auditorium of 10,000 people at any given time. that is not all about me. I represent the company. Our distributors have their own leadership networks that they've established, and they are better public speakers, even better communicators than I or any of my team will ever be. They are absolutely incredible, and the way they use their voice and their influence within these networks. And they also similarly use technology. They use physical meetings where they get people together, where they motivate them or they train them or they talk about different topics. So much of that now has gone online because of the pandemic, and I think people have learned to embrace that even more from an efficacy point of view. In terms of method, I don't know if I can answer your question in the best possible way, but I mean, for me, it's always been speaking from the heart, speaking from my own personal experience, speaking with stories, and always elevating other people above oneself. I think there's nothing more appealing and enchanting and effective as leadership humility. And to the extent that we demonstrate that, I think it engages people, it engages them with their heart, and it can translate into action. And you represent probably one of the most famous organizations in the world with respect to public speaking and leadership, and you know that people don't necessarily remember what you told them at any given time. They remember how you made them feel. And I think that informs some of what we try to do here, and also what our distributors do so effectively out there, is they make people feel like they belong to something, and that they can make a difference, and that they are empowered, and that they have control over their life and their destiny. And those are universal things that I think motivate all of us to fellowship. They motivate our behavior, and they make us feel fulfilled at the end of the day.
Well, I agree with all of that. Transparency, speaking from the heart, elevating people above you, etc. It's all perfect. Are there any things that I haven't asked you about leadership which you think we could have discussed? Not necessarily, Greg. I guess there probably are. For me, I've seen people come to Japan, people in my positions in other companies, and they fall into two categories, and you've probably seen truckloads more than I have. And they fall into two very distinct categories. Either they fail spectacularly, or they tend to be rather successful. And there's kind of not much middle ground. And I think the things that make people fail is not being humble and not respecting the culture, not being respectful of the fact that you are in a different culture and that you are a guest, and trying to impose your worldview on the people that you're trying to lead. Because you're going to fail, because the power and the strength of the existing culture and the resistance to that kind of behavior is just going to it's going to wipe you out any day of the week. Often that, though, is being driven by headquarters. When people are, as you mentioned before, typically when they're sent on assignment, there's a change agenda or a result agenda behind that choice of who they're sent. And so they've got someone back at headquarters, their boss, saying, Greg, we're sending you out to Japan, don't screw this up. Make sure you get the results or you're out of here, So they land at, Hanedora, they landed at Narita, and they've got that in their brain. I've got to get the results. I've got to turn this around. I've got to bulldoze my way over the top of all this resistance, because if we keep doing the same thing in the same way, we're going to get the same result, and I'm going to get fired anyway. So that's in their brain. So just thinking about, some advice for people coming, what have they got to do to inject some sort of interregnum into their mindset to actually think differently about what they've actually got to do here to be successful? How can they sort of take away the vicious glare of their boss back at headquarters on what they're doing and actually look realistically at what's going on and what's possible?
I think it's an easy out to blame the headquarters. I think, if we like to think of ourselves as quality leaders, we should have the ability to balance that stuff out. If we merely, yes, we are the servants of headquarters and we've sent on a mission to execute and get a result, but simultaneously we are put into a mentorship and leadership role of people here, and we are in charge of organizations that have a role in society. And so it's a responsibility, not just to getting what our shareholders want, but it's a responsibility to everything that exists here. If you ignore this piece, I think you will fail in achieving your mission. And so I guess the answer to that, and it's not an easy answer, is you've got to be patient with yourself. And I think trying to engender some patience in your shareholders and your bosses at headquarters to say, listen, it's not going to happen in year one. It's going to take a little bit of time. I think gives the leader the time to adapt and to understand all these nuances and then be able to start working with them in a way that can deliver on the mission that they've been sent to achieve.
So apart from that, what would be some other advice for someone who's going to be sent to Japan, who's just arrived? They're going to have their posting here, 3, 5, whatever it might be, years. What would be some other piece of advice you'd give them?
Don't jump to conclusions. I did. I've made all the mistakes in the book, and I probably will still make some more. You make assumptions about things. I'll give you a simplistic example, and that maybe learn from my mistakes. Is I came here and I got bogged down in meetings. Everybody wanted a bit of face time. Everybody wanted to show what they wanted to do. Every single board meeting we had or executive leadership team meeting we had got preceded by an endless array of nemawashi meetings. And I just thought, this is insane. I mean, this is just not a good use of time. And we're going through all this form, and what's the output, all of it. And so the whole idea, for example, of nemawashi was just crazy to me.
So nemawashi, for people who don't know Japanese, means groundwork. So you have some groundwork where you go to people who are going to be in the meeting. Prior to the meeting, you sell them on what you want to have happen, get their agreement. And so when we roll up to the meeting, it's more of a formal rubber stamp of what's already been decided.
Correct.
Informally.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg, for that explanation. Exactly. And so, my experience is just get into the boardroom, have a big fat argument, and figure it out, and walk out the boardroom. It might not be 100%, you'll be 80% there. Execute and, figure out the rough bumps on the road. And I look back and I'm thinking, how arrogant and naive was I to make that assumption in the beginning, using this little example? Because I've come to the conclusion that nemawashi works brilliantly. Because, yes, it takes longer. Yes, you have more meetings. But when you hit the go button, it works. And it works beautifully. Net, you actually, by the time you get to 100%, it's taking you exactly the same amount of time. Nemawashi just puts some of the pain up front. Whereas in my previous model, you kind of stretch out the pain over time, but you get to the same place at the same time. So, and I think in the process of using nemawashi, people feel more comfortable, they feel more confident, they feel more engaged in the process, they feel more heard. It's an empowering process. And so it's a very small example of coming in cold, making assumptions about certain ways of working, say this is an extraordinary waste of time, I'm going to change all of it. And actually you just create disruption, you put roadblocks in the way, you make your people uncomfortable, and you just, you're not any quicker to gaining an outcome.
It's interesting, isn't it? When you think about if we're putting together a project team, okay, project, so we should get people from this silo and this silo and this silo and this silo involved, and we should have diversity. These days we talk a lot about diversity, so we have lots of free flow of opinion, so we'll have a very rich harvest here of ideas from the group on how to get this project to work, which I think in a Western context, people can understand that. Oh, that makes sense. But the concept that you'd have that same basic process being done before the meeting, where you're actually harmonizing opinions and your own opinion, because you have a thought, you think, well, I think we could do it this way, and then someone gives you a piece of information which you hadn't even entertained, and you realize, oh, okay, well, I didn't know that. I'll have to adjust that. So all of that sort of adjustment, which would go on in a project team with this rich harvest of different diverse individuals, gets done before the meeting, so that as we get into the meeting, then we have a common understanding, we've sorted out all the rough bits, I think for us, we can understand the project team, we just have a bit of trouble understanding the meeting environment being like that. Well, any final piece of advice? You've given us some real gems here. I'm going to just pump you for maybe one more, because you've got a lot of good experience here, a lot of good examples. What would be the final piece of advice for someone new to Japan? Should they learn Japanese?
It depends how long you're going to be here, I guess. And if you're on I came here on a initially a 3-year assignment, then it got extended by 2 years, and it's kind of in this bite-sized extension. And I hope it carries on for as long as possible, because we absolutely love it here. But my advice is, yes, you have to try and learn Japanese. I think that's important. Personally, my Japanese is horrible, but I try. And I think that's been true for not only Japan, but any other cultures that I've lived and worked, because it demonstrates that you are showing respect to the culture, that you are trying to, you may not ever really integrate, but you are doing your best to do so. I think it shows respect to people. So my advice is, even if it's basic survival Japanese, at least to do that.
Well, I would agree with that, actually. I think that's good advice too. And you made a good point. I'm coming here for 3 years, but ultimately you could be here for longer.
Right.
And then you wind up at 6 years or 7 years, you don't speak any Japanese, you think, geez, I've been here for 7 years. If I'd studied Japanese harder, I'd be really speaking good Japanese today. So yeah, it's too late by then, isn't it? So better to take the punt at the beginning. And if you're only here for 3 years, you're only here for 3 years. But if you go longer, then the benefits accrue. So thank you. Peter, this has been a very fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I've learned a lot. And I know, you've got such great experience, such great perspective, and you've been willing to share that. So very much appreciated. So thank you.
Greg, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been wonderful to chat to you.
So please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.